Mr. Chairman, we are ready.
Okay, thank you. The meeting will come to order. Could you take the roll, please, and maybe leave it open for a while members come in? Thanks.
Yes, sir. Senator Driscoll, leaving that open.
Excused.
Okay. Senator Murphy?
Here.
Senator Guru?
Here.
Senator Hicks?
Here.
Senator Steinmetz?
Here.
Representative Harshman is
Excused.
not yet online. Representative Knapp?
Here.
Representative Larson?
Here.
He is
Excused.
online.
He should be online.
He is
here?
online, sir. Yes. Representative Storer? Representative Walters? Vice Chairman Nethercott?
Here.
Chairman Obermueller?
Here.
You have a quorum.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. The committee members, the LSO staff has gone the extra mile in preparing for these 2 days, and I want to thank them. They're all such professionals. It's just absolutely amazing. And so I think because of the work that they've done, I think the next 2 days will be a great learning experience for everybody. We are all students here. We're a monitoring committee, and we can't monitor without a baseline of knowledge. So here we are, and ready to learn. The committee is made up of leaders in the House and Senate, so I hope the committee will relax, learn, and enjoy these next 2 days. Our testimony today comes from folks who have the support of the citizens of the state and experts in their respective positions, and therefore the stage really belongs to all of you out here. Thank you for coming, and we look forward to broadening our knowledge as you all present. Don't be offended if I ask you to wrap up your remarks. I'm going to try to stay as close to our schedule as we can. Thanks to the Treasurer's Office for hosting us this afternoon. We look forward to that trip. And with that, I will invite Ian to join the committee and talk to us about our duties and the default rules.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Ian. Floor is yours.
Great, thank you. The first thing on the agenda is just to discuss some of the basics of the committee, including the statutory commands that are required of this committee, as well as the rules that the committee has to follow during the interim.
Can you pull your mic a little bit closer, Ian?
It's typical to do this the first meeting of the year, so that we have a baseline to operate from. First thing I'd like to discuss, it's in your materials. There's a copy of our Wyoming statutes that guide the committee. It's 28-11-201 in the front of your packet of materials. I'll briefly discuss some of the elements of those statutory duties. In subsection B of that statute, it talks about the 6 different elements of the committee's duties. I'm going to go through each one of those. Of course, the committee has to select a chairman and a vice chairman, which we've done. The committee must monitor the establishment and implementation of investment policies by SLIB, as well as whether those investment goals are being met and achieved. Number 3, I'm going to come back to in just a minute because it deserves a little bit of special discussion. Number 4 talks about the committee's obligation to prepare and submit recommendations to the legislature, including sponsoring legislation to improve statutes related to the investment of state and local government funds. The committee must develop knowledge and expertise among its members regarding issues related to investment of public funds and capital financing. And the committee must monitor state funds invested for a specific public purpose. Those PPIs or public purpose investments are the subject of a report later in this interim and is a regular part of our business that we'll handle later, so that's covered. I want to discuss number 3 because it's something the chairman and I have discussed some. It's the requirement that the committee monitor the establishment and implementation of state capital financing policy by the State Building Commission and any other state entity charged with capital financing. The question is, Chairman Obermueller asked, what does that mean and when do we do that during this interim? And the answer to that is that we really don't and it hasn't been a big part of our agenda for a number of years, primarily because the state doesn't use bonding and a lot of, financing methods to fund our state capital, transfers from other accounts. However, Don Richards and I had a brief discussion about what that meant. He has a lot more experience with the committee and what we've done in the past. And in fact, it is a relevant element of this committee's duties should the state need to use other financing methods for its capital finance. Within the past 10 years, he could remember that there was a bond issuance for the state penitentiary. It was paid off early, but the committee did receive some information on that and monitored that process. As well as in the past 10 more years ago, there was tax revenue anticipation notes that were used for financing of some of the state's expenses in order to maintain their more beneficial interest rates on their other obligations. And so originally the question might be, well, does that need to be repealed because it's no longer, because it's obsolete? And it's up to the committee about what it would like to do with those sort of things. But the idea is that it may still be relevant to the extent the state does at some point need to use other financing methods for its capital needs. There's a list in that same statute about what the State Loan and Investment Board has to provide to the committee. It's just simply a requirement that they, more or less, that they participate with us, that they give us copies of, invite us to their meetings, give us copies of their minutes, et cetera. And then finally, Section D of that statute says what this select committee may do. And is that we may secure consulting services if necessary, review budgets and expenditures related to any aspect of state investment policy and its implementation, and review budgets and expenditures related to any aspect of state capital financing policy and its implementation. Are there any questions about that?
Ian, do you know if I'm just trying to remember for myself, do we get those notices from SLIB on our meetings?
We do,
Is that okay?
Mr. Chairman, yes. Yeah.
And the other item is number 5 and what we shall do. Number Romanet 5 says develop knowledge and expertise among its members regarding issues. That's probably if we were to redo this statute, that's probably number 2 after selecting a chairman and vice chairman. Just food for thought there. That is what we're doing here today for sure, and tomorrow, developing knowledge. I question whether we're developing expertise. That's why we have the people that are sitting out here. They're the experts. We're trying to gain knowledge so that we can do a modicum of oversight in these areas, that are very technical in most cases. And so we're relying on the expertise of the people that come to this committee. So carry on.
Very good. And Mr. Chairman, certainly that's consistent with the committee. What the committee's done in the past is rely on the experts at the state treasurer's office, et cetera, to do those, but to get enough knowledge so that we can understand the information that they present to us. Very good. With that, then I'll move on.
A question online. Who is? Oh, Representative Larson.
Thank you, Mr.
You have a
Chairman.
question?
Hear me okay?
You'll have to turn on your mic.
I did. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Can you hear me? We can't hear you yet, Lloyd. I understood that, but I don't think the rest of the committee.
Yeah, I don't know what the deal is, Karen. My mic is on.
All right, well, when you get the technical issue solved, we'll let you weigh in at that time. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman,
Representative
Representative
Hicks.
Larson, if your speaker is not working, maybe you can type that into in the chat box and we can get your question answered.
Mr. Chairman, I might also note that I believe that the computer was annotating what he was saying, even though that we can't hear it. So it may give us, yeah, that's odd.
Can you see my annotations now? So my question.
Representative Larson, yes, we can see the annotations.
Thank you, Karen. So my question to Ian is, where does this committee then get its authority to sponsor
So
legislation?
my
or not
question is,
sponsor?
where does this community then get its authority to sponsor legislation?
Does that come
Committee.
through statute or from management council?
Mr. Chairman?
Ian,
Does
you
that
want to
come through
handle that?
Statute or through management council?
Yes. Representative Larson, Mr. Chairman, yes, the statute itself gives this committee the authority to sponsor legislation. That's in B4 of that handout in 2811-201B4. Prepare and submit recommendations to the legislature, including sponsoring legislation to improve statutes related to the investment of state and local government funds.
Thank you. Carry on, Ian.
Very good. So the next thing I'll talk about is just the general idea of what rules does this committee follow. Consistent with the rules of the Senate and House regarding interim committees, select committees also follow the default rules that are in an appendix to the rules and into the manual of legislative procedure, absent the committee adopting other rules. And those default rules are also in the next portion of your handout. I'll go through a couple of those just to describe them, and we have one conflict that we may also want to resolve. But yeah, so absent the committee's specific guidance on the rules and adoption of different rules, there are default rules that apply. They're fairly basic, and they're, again, in your packet of materials, but they talk about the duties of the chairman and the vice chairman, the details for calling and holding meetings, the notice and agendas that are required. The second page of those talks about how you establish a quorum to vote on the procedures, on the decisions of the committee. That's the part where there's a difference between the House and the Senate, and I'll go through that in just a second. It talks about the order of business, specifically addresses a motion to reconsider and how interim committees handle that. Has quite a bit of details on subcommittees, how they're composed and their voting and their ability to have meetings, et cetera. And then it wraps up with talking about the chairman and members' ability to attend other meetings and procedural guidelines, and the fact that the issues that aren't handled here might be handled in the Manual of Legislative Procedure, which handles a lot of other details for committee meetings. The conflict I noted has been created in the last 2 years with the votes of the House and Senate to adopt slightly different versions when it comes to what constitutes a quorum and what that means. In typical legislative business, is consistent with the House position on this. That is that simply a quorum of this committee is a majority of the members appointed to the committee. The Senate, however, defines quorum to be two different things. A quorum, for purposes of conducting the meeting generally, is a majority of each of the houses appointed. And then it specifically provides that when you're talking about sponsoring legislation, you have to have the vote of a majority of each house to be able to sponsor that legislation. Over the years, that's been something that's been debated by various committees, for various purposes. Typically, it's just a majority of the members constitute the quorum and can take any action from the committee. But I might suggest to this committee and to the chairman that we at least decide which of those rules we want to have, so that when we do decide to sponsor legislation or take action, it's clear the vote that the committee needs to do that. So with that, I can answer any other questions.
All right, thank you, Ian. I believe we'll take up the question of the rule that he brought up, where we need to make a decision. Any comments about that from the committee? Who wants to talk to that? Senator Grew.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With regards to item number 3 and the state financing with the State Building Commission, just since Mr. Shaw brought it up, just wanted to kind of throw it out there. I, for one, would like it to stay in, and further, actually would like for our next meeting to ask the State Building Commission to appear in front of this committee just to talk about, where they see, capital construction going from their vantage point and how that might affect us, and if they, and what their plans are and what they have on their plate. Mm-hmm. So I think that it would kind of be what we would be better served as a committee, having that information straight from them. I know that comes through appropriations and it comes through all that process, but from a financing standpoint, maybe it might be something that we might want to take a look at in a different perspective. Maybe not, but I'd just like to hear it from them, have this committee hear it from them, to maybe, just take that on if we choose to. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Any other comments about any of the testimony from Ian?
Mr. Chairman,
Uh,
did you want us?
Chairman,
Why?
Vice Chairman,
Senator Nethercott's fine.
Senator Nethercott.
Mr. Chairman, did you want us to make a motion for the rules?
I would entertain such a motion.
I would move that for purposes of a general quorum for us convening and taking testimony, that it's a majority of the committee in total, regardless of House. But for purposes of sponsoring legislation, it needs to be a majority of each House. The reason for that is sometimes because there's only 5 senators, if a couple senators are late or they leave because they're late from lunch or just out for a minute, we have to wait until they come back. And sometimes that can just slow down a meeting in progress if we don't have a quorum in order just to continue with taking testimony or the work of the committee. But I think also to recognize the need to be efficient with our time in session, that if we don't have a majority of both houses sponsoring legislation, that it's unlikely to pass either house in session. And so I think it's prudent to, for purposes of taking testimony and continuing with a meeting, a quorum of the committee in total, but sponsoring legislation, a majority of each house. So that's my motion, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman.
Second, Ogden Driscoll.
Senator Hicks.
Well, I was going to do that and just reiterate that the time constraints, especially in a budget session, and have to go through introductory votes. And so if we can't get the committee in both chambers, we do waste a significant amount of time on an exercise. This is not an election cycle, so it'll be the exact same committees that we have that see the legislation. It's not new eyes on this. And so I think it is, particularly in budget sessions and the second year of election cycle, it's prudent to maintain that it's a quorum of a majority of both houses to sponsor legislation.
Anyone else want to weigh in?
Mr. Chairman.
Representative, or Chairman Harshman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think, excuse me, I've kind of caught the summer cold, but it's kind of a new phenomena. I think this rule change, historically, it's not been the case. Historically, these interim committees have worked together, and really, particularly for this committee, with 5 members from each side. And for example, if one House member is gone today, then really 2 House members rule the whole thing. And I think so you could have, a vote of 7 votes to 2, and the bill will not pass. And I think, so traditionally we haven't done this both sides. That bicameralism will have its place, when we get into the session. But I think here we've kind of dropped all that. And it's about working together to try to solve these issues as we've been appointed to this committee. So historically, we haven't done this. It's kind of a new phenomenon. I would encourage us not to, and particularly just because if one person is gone, 2 members of that body then are going to run the agenda and run the committee. And I don't think that's, really the intent that any of us want. So I'd urge us to vote no on this motion and just adopt the standard rules. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman Harshman. Anyone else want to weigh in?
Mr. Chairman, if I may.
Yes, Senator Nethercott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Nethercott.
Just in response to, it's a new phenomenon, I can tell you that the Judiciary Committee had operated that way for the last 6 years until just this year with the new chairman, or 7 years, I would say. So at least in some of the committees, they did operate that way. And it worked effectively, and it actually wasn't that a problem. I think it's potentially not as big of a deal as we always make it at the beginning of these interims.
Anyone else want to weigh in on this topic? I think I will weigh in too. I'm also going to vote no on this. I think as a committee that's equally divided, 6 and 6, I think we can operate as a unit and take into account the things that Chairman Harshman has brought up and just operate as a committee, up or down votes. So I'll vote no. Thank you. All right, question has been called. All in favor of the motion, raise your hand. Who's online? I see 5 votes for. Those against, raise your hand. Did you get, LSO staff, did you get a count on that, or do we need to do it again? Ian, do you know how that vote went, or do we need to take it again?
Mr. Chairman, I don't. Karen, I'm sorry. I don't. Okay, if you would like to take it
All
again.
right, all those in favor of the motion, raise your hand.
If you, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, all opposed, raise your hand.
Us divided against us.
Sir, it is a 6 to 6.
It's what?
It is 6 to 6.
6 to 6, the motion fails. So Ian, where do we stand on this? Have we by that adopted the other rules, or do we need to vote on?
Mr. Chairman, I think it would be appropriate then to have a new motion that is to adopt the standard rules with the House's position on, now we can fail that again, but the result is if we can't pass the motion that gives the Senate's position on these rules, then the default would be the House's position, which is fine, but it would be safe for the committee to take that as a motion and pass those rules as our default rules.
Mr. Chairman, I'll make that motion.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded that we adopt the House version of the rules. Any discussion? All in favor, raise your hand. Okay. And those opposed? 3. That passes 9 to 3. Does that wrap up your testimony?
Mr. Chairman, it does.
All
Thank
right,
you.
thank you very much. I think we're ready to move on then to our next agenda item. And that is investment policies. Good morning to the treasurer's office.
Chairman, we've got a few new people here and a few new members, so I think I'd like to introduce everybody in this room to the folks that are here.
Yeah, please do.
We'll start in the back with Katie. She's our person that's the best accountant, I think, in the state, public and private. Matt Sackett, I think a lot of you guys do know already. He's a policy guy. And the new face in the room is Norm LeBlanc. Norm is our COO, and he was put on board, I think it was May 30th, and just a blistering speed of implementation of about 14 months since you guys approved the budget on that position. With Don Williams, a lot of you do know Don, and Caleb Simpson here. Caleb is going to be, basically, he's got a new title, but no no new money, and that's like deputy CIO. So just for your just a little bit of succession planning within the treasurer's office, and Caleb's really stepped up to the job, so he's going to be moving forward with that distinction. So that's where we're at today.
Welcome. Proceed with your testimony.
We have one more special guest, Mr. Chairman, and that's Mr. Patrick Fleming,
Oh, there's Patrick.
who's our Chief Investment Officer, and will be guiding us through the topic today, appearing remote.
Welcome, Patrick. And I guess the stage is yours, huh?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Patrick Fleming. I'm CIO for the Treasurer's Office. Today, we're going to initially start off with policy statement changes to our IPS. So I'd like to go through the various changes that we put through, but I would suggest that I just do the highlighted version instead of the redlined version. I think that would take a significant amount of time, but if you want to go point by point, I'm happy to do so, Mr. Chairman. What is your pleasure?
Yeah, I agree with you. Just take it at a high level. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The main point that I'd like to put across is there's really four different components that I'd like to address that were really addressed in the IPS. And just so everyone knows as a refresher, how our policy changes to the investment policy statement usually take place is we start off with asset allocation in March. Many of you are part of that. We then put forth through the investment finance committee, and then a special meeting with the SLIB board. And then the June meeting is when we go through and make the big changes. This year, we had some substantive changes that we put forth through the changes that you implemented in the legislative session, where we put together many of the funds. Some other changes that we had with these substantial changes would be ESG policy that the treasurer is working on. This is also included in the proxy voting as well. And that is going to be addressed tomorrow, primarily through another section in the bill, or in these meetings. The next one would be the state agency pool. That is also on the docket, a topic for tomorrow. So that is something that I will discuss more in detail. We have quite a bit of time carved out for the changes in the SAP. The next one that I'd like to address would be benchmark changes that we put forth. There were two benchmark changes. The first one was an easy one. It was primarily from bank loans, and the S&P LSTA, which was a benchmark that we previously used. They wanted to charge us about $25,000 just for using that. There's another benchmark, which is a Credit Suisse benchmark. It's very, very similar. So we changed that and saved $25,000 for doing that. The bigger one, which was it was a very robust discussion, was changes to the way that we manage our external equities. And that's the both passive and active investment of international equity. So we have two different components. We have broad US, which is a benchmark versus the S&P 500. And then we have international, what is called the ACWI-X, and that stands for All Country World Index, ex-US. And that's about 50% of the world benchmark. So what we were looking at is, with some of the changes that have happened with China's leadership, we did not want to have passive exposure to China as opposed to our active investment, where we have boots on the ground, active people in there and really understand it. They can overweight, underweight, and China is such a massive, large part of the global economy. We didn't want to be out of it, but we didn't want to just have market weight to an index that we really couldn't control. So we instituted a different policy, a different benchmark, which is called the.
We lost your audio, Patrick.
Oh, is that better?
Yes, thanks.
I just hit it with my finger. Sorry, Mr. Chairman. So that is called the ACWI-XX, All Country World Index, ex-US and ex-China. So that way it just allows us to have more of a better risk-adjusted return by still investing in emerging market economies. And it's predominantly in those economies that would do very well with China growth, but it would also allow us just to be more specific and have a controlled investment around China and some of the changes that they've done. The big one was the consolidation of the funds, which you are all aware of and voted on. And so with this one, over a year ago, the committee talked about how can we improve the returns to the state's funds. And one of them was the way that we've had these segregated accounts, the asset allocations from the various different funds that we have that are very different. And instead, what we wanted to do was to have a more of an endowment-like investment structure that we could go for the highest returning assets. To do so, we had to increase the reserve accounts, which you all approved for and is in the process of being implemented. And so with that, I would like to pass or go on to page, I think it's page 3, Karen, which will show the pool allocations using the total rate of return strategy for your review. Next page, please. So this is basically the groupings that we've done to allow all of the various strategies that we have, and it just has a rough percentage. We don't have 2023 numbers, obviously, of showing what each pool will own. And so with this, we're able to reduce the amount of investments significantly. We're basically consolidating all of them, and then we're able to strive for the highest return. We're not going to have an endowment type return, because endowments, their funds are not inviolate, and they have significant income coming through and so forth, so they can be extremely illiquid where we cannot. But with this, I think is very important, and hopefully over time you'll be able to see the returns. But the biggest difference in what we've done here is we've changed 2 of our funds, Common School and Higher Ed, and they were invested in what's called an income-focused return. Because of the spending policy, which is a 5%, there was a need or a thought that because our reserve accounts were too low, that we're not able to achieve that 5% without having a significant larger portion of income focused like bonds. And so what we did by changing this and moving them all together, this allows us to take all of the permanent funds and have one strategic allocation. Now, I want to let everyone kind of look at this and just understand that you just cannot change this overnight. This is going to be a long process. We have what's called a pacing schedule. And the biggest allocation difference is that we will now be investing private equity into these 2, what were previously income-focused funds, which is Common School and Higher Education, in private equity. And then we're going to take out preferreds, which really doesn't matter. But the private equity investment takes a significant amount of time, because you can't just take 100% and put it in at one time. With private equity investment, it needs to be drawn out in what is called a pacing schedule. You don't want to have everything in one year. You want to have it drawn out over numerous years. And it also takes a significant amount of time for us to find these best managers, because there's a significant differentiation between the first quartile and the third quartile managers. It's 6% differentiation. So we only want to invest with the best ones, and they're not open every year. So it takes time. So the best estimated guess that we will be able to get Higher Ed and Common School to have that same allocation, it's going to take about 5 to 7 years. Conversely, for our total return funds like the PMTF, we're still in the process of implementing those. We're still about 2 to 3 years before we will be fully implementing those, and that's with private equity, private credit, infrastructure, et cetera. Now, I want to differentiate here and make sure that everyone's understanding this is very clear.
Mr. Chair, could I ask a
Senator
question
Hicks?
before you move on, Patrick? So, Mr. Chairman, the question is on the private equity. What's the target on that as far as the asset allocation? Is it 10, 20, 30% of the overall asset allocation for those funds?
Mr. Chairman, Senator, Karen, would you change to the next slide, please?
There we go.
Very prescient, Mr. Senator. So you're jumping in front of my presentation here, but this is the differentiation between the different funds. So if you look at it, you can see on the left-hand side, and this was common schools, asset allocation, before, and then afterwards. So you can see how on the left-hand side, they did not have private equity. And now on the right-hand side, you can see that it's at 15%. And just look at the middle one, because that's really the target. What we shoot for is that middle allocation. So that's a significant increase. And it will take us some time to do that. But these will be the right-hand side, the long-term permanent fund allocations. These will be the targets that we'll shoot for.
Senator Furphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Along those same lines, if you look at the maximum amount, 22.5%, how are you measuring the risk in those private equity investments? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Senator, yes, the mandate that has been put forth upon us with the permanent funds is to have a 22% volatility with a 99% confidence interval. So when we look at our risk, it's predicated on a 70-30 portfolio as opposed to equity and fixed income. That was another wonderful thing that you put forth and approved that allows us to look at risk as opposed to an asset class. So every year with that asset allocation meeting, as I referred to earlier with RBK, we look through all of the allocations that we have, and we understand how much risk is associated with this allocation. So it is under 22%. I think it's 18 or 19. I have the numbers in one of these presentations if you would like me to pull it up, or I can send it to you later. That this allocation, the risk associated with it, but it is under that 22% with a 99% confidence interval. Now, the reason they use 99 is that's kind of the 1 in 100-year flood. There will be times that you'll go above that, but it's when we do it, it's analyzed over a yearly period. So you could have a daily or weekly period on it, but when you implement the asset, it needs to be within that category.
Follow up. Senator Grew.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Fleming, so when you talk about 22% volatility and 99% confidence rating, and then go back to what you said about the managers and making sure that we have the upper quartile of managers, not having that puts those numbers at risk. Is that not correct? If we do something where we can't access the best managers, or we have to drop down a tier, that would possibly put those numbers at risk or raise our risk factor?
Mr. Chairman, Senator, yes, each one of the managers will have a different risk, but more the asset of the allocation or the component of that asset has a much higher risk. So for instance, within the private equity universe, venture capital is included in that area. So venture capital has a higher volatility than large cap buyout, for instance, and that's our largest allocation would be large cap buyout. So each component of it, whether it would be secondaries, large cap buyout, middle market, whatever, those would be the ones that are really more volatile, is the subcomponent of that asset class and who the managers are. The first and third quartile managers, they're not necessarily, the volatility isn't as important as the performance. It's just some of them are just very, very good at what they do and extremely hard to get into first quartile managers. We can't just go in and say, hey, you know, we're state of Wyoming, here's $50 million. Most of these funds are closed. It's difficult to get into, and that's one thing that we have been working on for the last 3 to 4 years to be able to access these funds. And so far, so good. We have been able to do so.
Thank you.
Anyone else with any questions right now? Carry on, Patrick, if you have more. Oh, Senator
Thank you,
Hicks.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Hicks, sorry,
So-
Patrick.
Patrick, when we look at this slide and we look at your minimum and the transition that we've gone from where we're at now and where we're moving, and to fully implement this strategy, you're saying 5 to 7 years. But where do you anticipate that we'll hit those minimum levels with the current new asset allocation? Is that something that the SLIB board and the asset allocation is already moving to those minimums, or is that part of that 5-year build out to even get into the minimum asset allocation with the new asset allocations? Are we at those minimums now, or when do we anticipate to hit those in that 5 to 7 year horizon?
Mr. Chairman, Senator, yes, the minimums are really thought of is with the variation in volatility, minimum maximums, they change around significantly because of the overall portfolio. So for instance, if private equity, which does not move as much because it's only marked on a quarterly basis, that allocation difference could swing significantly from one quarter to another, depending on what large cap US equities do. But as far as hitting the minimum maximums, we are no longer able to do in-kind transfers. So we can't transfer ownership from the PMTF, for instance, into Common School. So all of these have to be new allocations. So just to let you know how long this is going to take, our next allocation is going to be in the private equity area, what's called secondaries. And the fund that we're looking at, the max that we were able to get into, another one of these top quartile managers, is $65 million. So the bulk of that allocation will go to Common School and higher ed because of the under allocation. But we're not even close to getting to the minimum, but we haven't even started either. And that would be a good segue into another point that I just want to bring up, is to make sure everyone understands the difference between the investment process in what the bill and what we did, and then the accounting process, because they're two separate and distinct different ideas. We are full go on the investment side right now, even without the reserve accounts being fully allocated. Now, from an accounting perspective, which Katie is going to address here shortly, that's a different story because of the process and how you have decided when to put in the reserve funds. But I just want to make sure everyone has known. I know a couple legislators have asked, it's like, well, with this delay, we don't want to delay the investments. And I'm like, no, you're not at all. We are already in this process. We're already in the process of moving the benchmarks and the China. We're already in the process of investing in private equities, and these funds will have private equity. They will have private credit. They will have infrastructure, but it will take time. That has nothing to do with the accounting side of it, which is completely different animal.
So, Mr. Chairman, and I think this is a very important point that I think, and Patrick and Kurt and you guys back me up on this. But when we did this last year and we set up the 5X for the reserve accounts and stuff, what we were doing was looking at the asset allocation from the PMPF and then projecting that over the last 5 years of returns and saying this was the lost opportunity cost. My concern is right now, because that was a fairly large number, I don't remember what, but it was a big number that got everybody's attention. I think there's getting back to the education component of this committee for the legislature and our expertise is, I think there's a number of members in the committee that assumed as soon as we passed this legislation within a year that this asset allocation was going to turn around and start just generating that 6% or 6.5% annual return on these other funds. That's not going to happen. It's going to take 5 to 7 years to fully invest all of these into this asset allocation, if I understand correctly. So consequently, we can't have a realistic expectation that we're going to hit those level of returns from the PMPF within 1 year. Is that an accurate statement? Because I think we as a committee need to be able to, so next year or the year after, say, well, you guys said in CapFin and that if we do this, that we're going to get all these big returns and they're not showing up. Why? And it's because it takes 5 to 7 years to build this asset allocation out. Would you say that's an accurate representation, Patrick, of the way things, I just want to make sure this committee can explain this if there is something that comes back and says, why aren't we getting the same return as the PMPF?
Mr. Chairman, Senators, you're spot on. That is absolutely correct. And then also, I just want, well, there's a couple points, but first, with those reserve accounts, we're also going to move the reserve accounts into the same asset allocation as the fund, so they'll be pari passu with one another. That also will not happen until we get those fundings transferred across. So there's going to be two different components. The other part that we talked about, there was significant loss of income there, but until we can affect those transfers, that's not going to be switched across. But once we have everything together, and we're already going to start investing, but I just wanted to make it clear that when we look at the PMTF that has had private equity investments since 2004, and we can't transfer any of those over to common school, that the return of common school and higher ed will not be the same as a PMTF because its asset allocation will be different. The privates that they own will be different. We can't take the same amount that we had that will show up in the PMTF into common school. It might be higher, it might be lower, but we don't know what those numbers will be. But the allocation of the managers will be different, not the total allocation of private equity. They'll both have 15%, as you can see from the chart below, but the composition of those managers will be different. Because initially, as we build up common school, if we can only get 65 million of the secondary fund, predominantly the vast majority of it's going to go to common school and higher ed. They're going to get more of these allocations initially. So if they outperform, they will do better. But I just want to make sure everyone understands that. But that's a great point. You're absolutely correct.
Any other questions for Patrick from the committee? Go ahead, Patrick, if you have some more for us.
Well, with that, Mr. Chairman, I would like to pass it over to Katie to go over the accounting perspective that we had talked about that is very different from the investment side. So the investment side, we're 100% going full bore right now. We are going to be allocating. It will not impact the timing of these transfers, do not impact the investment side. From statutory purposes, Katie's side is different, so I'll pass it to Katie, the expert, and let her explain. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, thank you very much, Patrick. Katie, you want to introduce yourself to the public so that everybody knows who you are?
Yes, good morning. My name is Katie Smith. I am the Chief Financial Officer for the State Treasurer's Office and oversee the Financial Accounting Division for the State Treasurer's Office. The accounting process in order to implement this full strategy is obviously a little different, as Patrick had mentioned. We will start this in January of March of 2024. So through January and March of 2024, we're going to start building a testing environment with the new strategy. So that is first building this new structure in our testing environment. Then we'll make all of the transfers as if they were going live with these funds moving over to the new portfolio pools. Then we will test all of our processes and procedures. That's going from posting transactions to balancing with Wolf's and JP Morgan, all of our reconciliations, completing a full distribution cycle. So any income and gain and losses, we'll complete that in our testing environment as well. And then validating all of our new reporting. So we just went through an upgrade with our financial accounting system for our investments. And we've implemented and are in the process of implementing a lot of great new reports that are automating some of our processes. My biggest fear is I don't want to derail those advancements that we've just made. So that will be part of our process going into January and March of 2024 is validating that these reports are still going to be useful and still automate our processes, and we're not taking a step back with going into a new structure. And then March through June will really be, to me, phase one of implementation. We'll start paralleling. I always like to parallel a full quarter before I implement any new process. In a quarter, you get to see a few month ends, you get to see a quarter end, and most of the time, any variabilities or anything that could potentially happen usually comes out in the wash in a full quarter. You need that time to kind of vet everything out. So we will be paralleling for a full quarter in our testing environment to our production environment currently. Then we'll have to get with JP Morgan and create some new control account numbers. So our plan sub-accounting system is all based on control account numbers so that we have allocations for each of our investment pools. We'll have to create new control account numbers for these new investment pools to transition to the TRR. And so we'll have to get that done with JP Morgan during that parallel time. And then phase 2 to me is the go live implementation process. So that will be July 1st. We'll go live. Obviously, that's dependent on a very successful testing and paralleling process, which I have no fear in. Our system is upgraded and is far more flexible than it ever was before. We're utilizing 90% of it instead of 10% of it, and we will be up to 100% in no time. So I think it's far more flexible and easily manageable to transition into this new structure. So it's obviously dependent on that, but also it's dependent on those reserve funds being funded. And over the course of Section 300, there's a lot of priorities from LSRA. I'm sure some of you are very familiar and we're part of that process, but there's a lot of priorities, and then there's contingencies. There's State Auditor's Office is making some of those transfers based off of their calculations. And so the thought is that all the reserve funds would be funded by next year end. And July 1st, we could fully transition and make those things happen. So going in from 6/30 to July 1st will be a fun transition period to transition all of those funding sources to the new pools. But again, we'll have paralleled for 3 months. And before that, we'll have built it and tested it for 3 months. So that's the plan, that when we go into that, we're not going in blind. We've been prepared for 6 months to transition that over.
Okay, thank you. Committee, any questions for Katie? Senator Furphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I'm new on this committee, so probably ask some silly questions, but in this transition period, are you seeing anything in the portfolios that we should be taking losses on before we move to the new transition? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Furphy, we go through a cycle every year end where we realize any gains and we hold our losses. And so all of that would still be transpiring through that transition. So any losses that we had on our books at the end of fiscal year 24, next 6/30/2024, we would hold as we would normally, and we would recognize those gains and move those forward. So the distribution process wouldn't change. It's just going to be what pool those funds are sitting in. So the distribution process is still the same on the redirects and who's going to be getting those gains. Hopefully that answered your question.
Follow up? Anyone else in the committee with any questions for Katie? Thank you, Katie.
Thank you.
Anyone else here to testify, instruct us? Is everybody good? Okay.
Calling the state building commission, realize that's the top 5 elected officials, and that when you do that, if you would call and probably only 2 could show up because you don't have a quorum outside of the actual, business meetings that we have. But if you really want to understand the state building commission, I'd suggest you have liaisons that are to it. You got Representative Walters here that attends every one of them, and I think Representative Driscoll, I think, might be on that too. But anyway, that's a good area within your own meets and bounds to get some really good input. Or they're Zoomed all the time, and so you can get a really good aspect about what's going on in the state building commission there. So, but I mean, I'm sure you get 2 of the state building commissioners, but you couldn't get 3 because that's just kind of outside the process.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you very much. So does that completes the testimony from the treasurer's office? The next item on the agenda is a report about the IFC role in investment policy. We have Senator Driscoll and Representative Nicholas on the agenda, but I understand that there is a memo that will be presented on their behalf. Each of these, the senator and the representative are free to come to the mic if they want to. First, we'll start with a memo presentation, I believe. Karen?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Karen Vaughn, LSO Budget Fiscal. If you don't mind, I'd like to go ahead and go through that.
Yes, carry on.
The origins of the IFC actually began.
Can you pull the mic closer to yourself, Karen?
Yes,
Sorry.
sir. I should know better.
Thank you.
The origins of the IFC actually began in CAPFIN directly. To set the stage, I, of course, was not with LSO at the time. The Treasurer's Office had great needs, both in staffing and technology, and we're seeing that even today. And that's part of what's the impetus of what has led to a lot of these changes. The needs translated to oversight concerns and opportunities for costly errors. In addition, the state's investment climate was, needless to say, volatile. Fixed incomes, which was the bulk of our portfolio at the time, was suffering, and inflation or interest rates were on the rise. With that type of environment, the state obviously had concerns about meeting its budgetary obligations. The governor instituted budget reductions across the executive branch. Management Council did the same. And there was also consideration in the legislature of having a special session that year. It did not turn out that occurred, but we were looking for ways to improve. Specifically, Management Council directed the committee to take a deep dive regarding the state's investment performance, asset allocations, investment management fees, pending policies, and the constitutional and statutory provisions governing our investments. Coincidentally, that year, in Jackson, the Sovereign Wealth Forum was held. Treasurer Gordon at the time was very instrumental in making that happen, and we got a lot of great information from worldwide experts. Key takeaways were the need to establish an investment purpose and articulate it, the idea of investing with operational independence but with goal dependence, and empowering an internal management team unless there was a clear benefit to external management. At the committee's September meeting, following the forum, the governor or the treasurer also presented Cutter and Associates staffing and risk analysis of the treasurer's office. There were 12 findings, 8 of which were either high or critical. After discussing the state's financial investment expertise, one of the measures of 4 that Treasurer Gordon advocated for was an investment board. He asked that it be defined in statute and populated with individuals with professional credentials. He also added, though, that the SLIB's role should be in oversight, asset allocation, and the assessment of the results. At the time, Treasurer Gordon favored New Zealand Superfund and the way it was established. One of the things that is key in the Superfund is to insulate it from political influence. And what they do, the Minister of Finance appoints members to a selection panel, and the selection panel nominates members to their investment board. The IFC, when it was created, did the same thing. Each of the 5 members of SLIB not put forth one person to their selection panel. The selection panel then appoints to the IFC. So that is your double arm's length. The other thing that is important in New Zealand and other peer funds is the idea to serve for a specific term. The New Zealand Fund members of their investment board serve for 5 years and then are subject to review to see if they will be reappointed. Wyoming did that on a 3-year basis, with members of the IFC chosen by the selection panel also being subject to Senate confirmation. So 2017, we took all of this information, went into legislative session, and the legislature passed Senate File 49, which is the official document that created the IFC. When it was originally created, it was created with 6 voting members and 2 non-voting. 3 of the 6 voting members were embedded in state government. They were the state treasurer, a designee in the treasurer's office designated by the treasurer, and the Wyoming Retirement System's chief investment officer. The other 3 were decided by the selection panel. The 2 non-voting members, one was selected by the governor, liaison, and the other for the legislature was selected by management council. And so that's how we proceeded. Their original charge was to be consult in the development and submission of proposed investment policy statements or modifications to those statements, and to also consult with SLIB on the approval of investment managers. And that was their responsibility at the time. The legislature did put one additional item in that legislation, which was to come back in a couple years and find out how this was doing. And so that was set for the fall of 2019. Give it 2 years, see how it'll work out. Before the report came due in the 2018 session, the IFC performance compensation became a concern and was ultimately passed in 2019 for both the treasurer's office and the retirement system. The IFC was tasked at that time with setting the benchmarks for the state treasurer's office and reviewing the benchmarks that were established by the Wyoming Retirement Board for performance compensation for those 2 agencies. The IFC also, at the end of the year, goes through and essentially certifies that those benchmarks have been exceeded before performance compensation can be paid. So they now have a secondary task. 2019 comes around, and that summer, the select committee met 4 times between that summer and fall, and also established a working group based upon all the information that they had gathered over that summer and how well it's been working. That resulted in a lot of changes to the IFC in the 2020 session. There was general consensus for the IFC model, but they did recognize that there were some issues. For example, the IFC was a 6-member panel. A 7th member was added. We all know that in a lot of cases, committees with an odd number fare better than committees with an even number because you have a tiebreaker. So they added that member, and they added that member as a member being selected by the selection added within government. The role of the IFC in an effort to get something more clear and more involvement, they were charged with reviewing state investment policies and procedures and recommending statutory rule regulation changes in order to maximize our total returns, but still protect and consider the purpose of a particular fund. They were also charged with consulting with the treasurer and SLIB regarding the establishment and execution of investment policies, reporting to the legislature regarding investment policies, procedures, authorities, and execution of the same. And the state treasurer's office was required to consult with the IFC on the employment of a chief investment officer specifically. And the legislature established minimum requirements for that chief investment officer. Now, for the IFC members, not only do they have to be morally upright and not have a conflict of interest and have general knowledge of the financial industries, they have to have 7 years of investment management for a portfolio of at least $500 million, $500,000, excuse me. The same general requirements were held for the chief investment officer. However, the requirement was 10 years instead of the 7, and specifically had to have knowledge in 2 of a list of investment classes. At the same time, in that same legislation, they determined that the CIO would be the treasurer's designee to the IFC. When the IFC was created, it was required to meet at least quarterly. In 2020, in that same legislation, that was clarified and created more flexibility. Because of the way that the state meets in the early spring in order for asset allocations, and then again in the fall, modifications were done to the time that the IFC would meet. Now, keep in mind that all meetings of the IFC are not subject to public disclosure, and none of the materials, their tentative decisions, their deliberations, their considerations are subject to public review. So we know that they meet in the spring in order to consider asset allocations, and then they meet publicly with the SLIB in May, roughly May, in order to do the investment policy statements. They also meet in the fall, typically around the Treasurers Conference, and they meet later in the year for the purpose of the performance compensation. Now, they can meet at any other time ad hoc, and meetings can be called by either the chairman, which is the state treasurer, or by a majority of the members by written request. The composition of the IFC was amended again in 21. And what it did now, because we now have the treasurer, both CIOs, and 4 at-large members. And we have performance compensation. So the 2 CIOs were removed from being voting members of the IFC that sets the benchmarks in performance compensation to liaisons to the committee. The 2 spaces that they unseated were replaced by selected members from the selection panel. So as currently put together, the IFC is the state treasurer plus 6 at large. At the same time, the legislature gained an additional liaison. So instead of having 1 by management council, we have 1 appointed by the speaker and 1 appointed by the president. Last thing I want to address is 2021. House Bill 244 was passed by the legislature. And what that did was it required the IFC to undertake a study to assess options for improving investment of state funds. In doing so, the IFC considered several aspects central to developing our strength in investment management, organizational and investment structure and hierarchy, a delegation of responsibilities, budgetary control, office construction, and oversight. The IFC recognized that our current structure does have certain weaknesses and risks. Specifically, they noted that an elected position without meaningful investment, operational, or managerial capabilities was high. They noted that the IFC's advisory capacity was limited to provide actual oversight. They recognized that the treasurer's office had little autonomy over their budget or human resource process and had difficulty attracting and retaining talent, and that Wyoming's income distribution requirement created a unique emphasis on income over intergenerational equity. In its report, not only did they provide their recommendations, but they also provided precedent for their recommendations, looking at several sovereign wealth funds and other peer groups. The IFC concluded, as the Sovereign Wealth Forum had indicated earlier, that the best practice would be a sweeping change to the structure and function of the IFC. They recommended placing the IFC, replacing it with an investment board. And that would oversee a separate investment office, which they termed the Wyoming Investment Fund Department. They recommended that this department house all non-retirement, state permanent, and non-permanent fund investment activities, and that it be a separate legal entity established by statute with oversight from SLIB and the legislature, but that otherwise it would operate independently. They recommended that the SLIB continue to have final investment authority and public accountability. SLIB would maintain the authority for risk preference, strategic asset allocation, and approval of the investment policy. And they would receive board recommendations periodically, and at least once every 3 years, approve a maximum risk portfolio. The legislature's role would be oversight in by receiving and monitoring periodic performance and risk reporting. The legislature would also have oversight of the budgetary process for this department, with the IFC recommending that invested funds be the budgetary source of revenue for the department, and that the legislature approve it based on basis points of assets under management. The IFC recommended that the board also have 7 members, as it does now, and that it use the double arm's length, which it does now, and also that it select its chairman. It believed that members of the board would serve for 2 years, subject to reappointment, that they would meet, as they do now, at least 4 times a year, plus ad hoc meetings, and that it would have final authority over all external investment managers and internal management decisions. Structurally, the department would be operated by 2 chief officers, an executive officer and an investment officer. The executive officer would manage all of the day-to-day activities of the office: administrative, accounting, operations, technology, reporting, compliance, as well as interact with the legislature and the executive branch, which would allow the investment officer to actually concentrate on investment activities. Each would have the responsibility for the hiring, dismissal, and compensation of their staff, subject to that investment board's oversight. They believe that being outside the state's human resource silo would allow the board and the department to optimize recruiting and compensation programs. To date, the legislature has not acted on those recommendations. That concludes.
Thank you, Karen. I have just a question about, is it laid out in the statute as to who the liaisons report to? Is that established anywhere?
No, there isn't a requirement for the liaisons to report at any particular time or place or have any formal reporting requirement, no.
All right, thank you. Thank you for all the work you did on this memo. It kind of helps tee up the subject for the committee. This isn't the meeting to debate what's in there, the merits or demerits of anything that's there. This is the educational part, so that we have that out there for this committee to be thinking about between now and the next time this is on the agenda. So I appreciate the instruction today. And Chairman Nicholas, do you want to comment, or are you you're free to comment if you would like. I don't want to get into a lengthy debate about the merits or demerits, but maybe you could address the committee as to, what your role as a liaison, what you understand it to be, and how you communicate what you learn when you go to these meetings. Thanks.
So thank you, Chairman Overmule. Just briefly, is Patrick still online? Because what I'd like, if he's still there, if he can come back on his screen and have Patrick describe to you who the members are current members of the IFC are, and their kind of their background and qualifications, just so this committee understands the caliber and the firepower that we have who's serving on the IFC. So I don't know if he's listening in or not, but if not, if
There he is. Patrick, did you hear the question?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, I heard my name and I was on the phone, so I clicked off, but
Could
it
you,
was about the
could you,
IFC members?
yeah, could you introduce us to who makes up the IFC and their qualifications? Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Representative. Russell Reed is the vice chair, and they have a rotating basis on that. And Russell Reed has been in the markets for numerous years. He was formerly CIO from a Middle Eastern investment firm, and then he went over to CalSTRS, which is one of the largest funds in the United States. He was CIO there. And then the largest sovereign wealth fund in the United States, Alaska Permanent. He was CIO there. So Russell has a tremendous amount of experience. Ken Lay was former treasurer of the World Bank, dealt significantly with not only the investment side, but governance, working with other sovereign and supranational funds, has a tremendous amount of experience. Let's see, Tom Chapman, who is also on board of WRS. He has a wealth of experience, started out with Tudor on the investment side, extremely knowledgeable. He's probably one of the more knowledgeable individuals on a bunch of different aspects throughout the group. He's worked in private credit, in real estate, just has a wealth of knowledge.
Could you repeat his name, Patrick? Who is it?
Tom
Oh, Tom.
Chapman.
Yeah.
Cecilia Herbert. Cecilia has been involved through the banking industry for many years with her husband, James, who started First Republic and grew that into one of the largest banking systems in California. And she has been involved in numerous boards. She's currently on the BlackRock board right now, and has a wealth of experience from the board seating side of things. Let's see, who else do we have? Doug Dillard. Doug Dillard has run his own fund for many, many years. Doug is extremely knowledgeable in the equity side. He knows a tremendous amount about venture capital and private investments. I believe his fund is called Sawgrass, and a family office now that he manages. Still lives in the Bay Area and has a significant amount of connections with those individuals and the various firms. So he is extremely knowledgeable and has great connections on that side. We just hired a new member, Kathy Kerr. I think it's pronounced Kerr. And I've only spoken with Kathy a very short time. She has more knowledge on the bond side. She worked with Payden and Regal, which is one of our bond managers, a corporate bond manager, and also various boards. She's on a couple boards right now, and primarily oil and gas sector is her specialty. And I know I'm leaving someone out. How many do I have there? Who's?
You've talked to, you've named
Did I get
six
them all?
so far. You named six.
Richard
Okay.
Granis,
And of course, the
Richard.
chairman,
Dick
the
Granis. is
treasurer.
Patrick.
Oh, non-voting members as well?
Yeah,
Okay, I'm sorry. Yes, Dick is a non-voting member. He was the controller for one of the large tech companies. So he was the treasurer and controller, knows a tremendous amount about the short end of the market, financing aspects, a lot of the work with the state agency pool and some of the things that we worked with. He implemented those suggestions and strategies. Some of the things that I'm going to talk about tomorrow, working with Dick in some of the ways, in some of the different things that he did. He's very, very knowledgeable on that side. Sam Masudi, who is the CIO for Wyoming Retirement System that you all know, he is also a non-voting member. Sam, as you know, has a wealth of knowledge. He's been doing an unbelievable job at WRS. The returns that they have been able to turn around and be in the change in the quartiles that WRS has done has been tremendous. So, that's been a tremendous help across the board.
so, and just to follow up with that,
Go ahead, Chairman.
Patrick, I mean, you are probably know more about the IFC than anybody else. So it occurred to me that it might be useful for you just to describe your interaction with them and what they perform for your for your office and your as the CIO of the Treasury.
Mr. Chairman, Representative, they are a wonderful and valuable part of the investment process. As I mentioned in the different allocations that we're looking at in private equity and in private credit, I've reached out to a couple of the members to ask about any of the funds. Do you know these funds? Do you know anything about them? We've had one-on-one calls with them, looking at big picture types of different structures. When we were looking at the China exposure, is this something that we need to look at? Is there concern about having passive exposure to China? Reached out to various members. One of the beauties of having the IFC is that we rarely agree on things. We have very different opinions on how we should look at things like that, but the big picture wise, it's really a commonality of what's best for the state and how to get the highest return. If you look at some of the returns that we've been able to do and change the structure to go to this quasi-endowment model, with the treasurer, they were a very important part of that, I think, because as you know, I can say something to you and you say, well, does he have alternative, views on this or what he's having? But when you have a third party person out there who is looking at it very, very differently, I think it's tremendous. And I know they've testified before you many times, and having their view, I think is wonderful. You never want to have a group that everyone agrees upon. If you do that, it's groupthink and you're going to be you're going to have trouble. So as much as we go back and forth on the different views and how we're thinking, pros, cons, et cetera, having that ability for me to reach out and talk to someone outside my investment staff, which we talk all the time, and get a third party view who might look at things differently is absolutely wonderful.
And so I kind of diverged a little bit from what I was asking for, Patrick, but let me give some background and maybe you can fill in these gaps. So the big picture that I want that you will begin to learn about more and more as you work through on CapFin and also through the Treasurers Conference, you'll have an opportunity to meet the IFC. But it was created, like you read in the memo, right back in 2017. The whole purpose of the IFC is to create stability, uniformity, and long-term investment strategies, and to take a governance system that takes it out of politics for the sole purpose of getting the highest and greatest return for the state of Wyoming. And so that, and if you look at the Cutter report, that will be provided to you. If you look at the IFC report that came out in 2021, both of those talk about, in some regards, what is needed to make sure that we get the greatest return at the minimal acceptable amount of risk over the next 30 to 50 to 100 years for the state of Wyoming, and how that should be managed and reviewed. And so the concept is actually fairly simple. That should be done by the professionals, investment professionals, and the 5 electeds, even though they are accountable as the 5 electeds for our investment policies and procedures. They are elected, they're not experts. And so the question always is, how do you have the experts make the decision and still keep the accountability with your 5 elected officials? And so the IFC, in that sense, is still a work in progress. And that's why you've seen that in that memo, changes in 2019, 2020, 2021, because we learn as we go on better ways on how to fine tune what we're doing to empower them so that we can use their full expertise, but also to ensure that the 5 electeds maintain their accountability to the public, but that we have the greatest return possible and that we get the best advice on how we're investing our dollars. And it's not something that can happen overnight. And as Patrick talked about earlier, when we change our investment allocations, it's a slow process, and it's kind of a dilatory process. And so in order to effectuate, our overall total rate of return, essentially, which we have now and we're implementing, is a product of having the IFC advise us that that's the way to go to maximize our returns, which is a semi endowment type model. And so we're transitioning into that. So it's important, I think, that when you have the opportunity to meet with the IFC members and past members of CapFin to learn these steps in history, to know where we are now and to where we'll be going in the future. And so, and we'll work on some of that when we dive into that our joint meeting in July. The ESG issue is a nice little example of what we're talking about. And the whole issue around ESG is and the pros and cons of it. The underlying issue
Let's not.
for us should be, let me just
Mr.
finish
Chairman,
the statement.
Mr. Chairman.
Is maximizing our returns. And so that we don't take actions which will impede our ability to make our best return. And so we'll talk about that, and we'll have presentations brought forward in July and probably after that as we wrestle with that particular issue. But and frankly, we will need IFC's input on that type of thing, because that's what they're there for. They're there to teach us to how to maximize our return and take politics out of that equation, so that we, the state of Wyoming, can benefit as much as possible with our investments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Committee, let's take a 10-minute break. We'll come back at 10 after 10 and pick it up with RVK. Thank you.
I think Senator Steinmetz had a question.
Senator Steinmetz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just really quick before our break. I understand the idea of taking politics out of this, but when you have some corporations that are bringing politics into it, how do we really take politics out of it, number one? And number two, shouldn't we be concerned about, the direction that we want to forge as a state and make sure that we're not, using the power of the purse in a way that would empower our enemies, basically, of fossil fuels and some of these other interests that we have as a state that some of these companies seem to be against. So how do we do that?
Senator, I'm going to close this discussion now. I think that's a good question, but this meeting was to just kind of tee up the subject for the future. You raise a great point. I did want to avoid the debate over these issues in this meeting, in this particular format because it's a big, as you know, a big topic with lots of discussion.
Well, and
So
Mr.
thank you for
Chairman,
the question.
I think
And
the
we will
easy
take our break right now.
Easy
Thank you.
response to that, Mr. Chairman, is that I'm not qualified. I'm not the expert. So experts, that's why we've got them. And that's the whole point.
Committee will reconvene, invite representative from RVK to speak to us. Is anyone from RVK here or online?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. You have Jake Dara with RVK. And I'm also joined by colleague Janelle Booth. And I've got a handful of slides I'm going to bring up.
Okay, go ahead.
And it looks like it's been disabled for me. There we go. All right, can everybody see my screen and hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we've got a handful of slides to kind of go over RVK's role, the responsibilities, and how we interface with the various groups with the State Treasurer's Office, the Investment Funds Committee, as well as SLIB. First, just to go over our core consulting team, Josh Keevan is the lead consultant for the State Treasurer's Office. He heads our Boise office. The rest of us, for the most part, reside in our Portland headquarters. Becky Gratzinger, who is our Chief Executive Officer, is a senior advisor on the relationship. Janelle Booth and Matthias Bauer are backup consultants. They both served the Wyoming team for 10 plus years in various roles. And then myself and Jason Hinton are associates on the relationship. Our primary responsibility is kind of an internal project manager, reviewing materials, keeping projects on track, and generally assisting Josh as the lead consultant. And then lastly, Rudy Carter is a senior investment analyst, and he's responsible for all of the performance reports, both quarterly and monthly, that get put together for the Treasurer's Office. So very much a team effort with this core consulting team. Josh is really the captain and the leader of the team. He's the one that primarily attends the meetings, leads discussions on performance and asset allocation. In a lot of cases, he's joined by Becky as the senior advisor, and they're really responsible for leading the team. In addition to the core consulting team, really we're backed by a variety of firm-wide resources here at RVK. Here at the bottom of the page, we've outlined a handful of these teams. First, the RVK Insights and Thought Leadership Team. This is a group that puts together a lot of market research and white papers. That group is actually headed up by Janelle. She may get into a bit more detail in a few slides on that. Our investment manager research team is a group of about 25 individuals whose sole responsibility is research and due diligence on investment managers. That group has subgroups within it that specialize in each asset class. So there are individuals who focus solely on public equity markets, public fixed income markets, as well as private markets. We have teams dedicated to private equity research, private credit research, and hedge funds. And the State Treasurer's Office has direct access to those teams. We work collaboratively with them anytime we are researching a new manager and doing a manager search, as well as just ongoing due diligence of the investment strategies. The capital markets research team, this is the team that puts together our annual capital markets assumptions that feed into our asset allocation analysis. So this group puts together each year, the assumptions include an expected return, an expected risk assumption, as well as a correlation between each individual asset class. So it's an extensive project each year that we do, and it gets completed at about February of each year. And then we use those assumptions to conduct our asset allocation analysis, which we do with the IFC, as well as the Treasurer's Office staff. And then lastly, the performance measurement and analytics group. This is a team of about 30 individuals that's their sole responsibility is producing performance reports. So this is Rudy as a senior investment analyst. It's his job to work with the treasurer's office staff, each individual investment manager, as well as the custodian JP Morgan to collect the data each month, reconcile everything, and put together those reports. On this slide, we have a listing of kind of the core responsibilities of RBK. A lot of these are pulled out directly from the investment policy. First and foremost is the asset allocation analysis and modeling. Again, this is using the annual assumptions that are put together by our capital markets research team. And then each year we meet with the IFC and staff over the course of 2 days and put together an extensive analysis of where the current portfolio stands, as well as the future outlook, utilizing each asset class assumption. And it's really a collaborative effort, working with the IFC, modeling different portfolios, and working with Treasurer's Office staff as well. Investment manager structure, again, this is an effort that Josh is the lead consultant on the relationship, as well as looping in our investment manager research team, and then also working with the Treasurer's Office staff to hire new managers, and then conduct oversight of the existing managers, monitoring changes in personnel, performance, and then the allocation of the individual managers. The typical process anytime a new manager is being selected. So for example, with the most recent asset allocation analysis, the allocations to private credit and private equity are increasing. So we will, in conjunction with staff, put together a kind of a best idea manager list for each asset class, and then compare that with the Treasurer's Office staff, have multiple discussions about those managers, which then goes on to an interview process with those managers, ultimately coming up with a recommendation for the IFC of those managers. And then past that, the IFC will bring that recommendation to SLIB for the ultimate approval. So it's a several step process anytime a new manager is selected. And then there's just ongoing due diligence, monitoring of the performance and the individual investment manager firms. Performance reports, we put together monthly and quarterly performance reports. The monthly performance reports are focused mostly on just the trailing returns. The quarterly performance reports get into extensive detail on the attribution of each manager, total fund attribution, investment policy compliance, as well as internal rate of return analysis for the alternative investments, as well as executive summary, written memos. And then lastly, we really serve as kind of an extension of staff. We work with Patrick and his team on a day-to-day basis with any ad hoc analysis, as well as monitoring manager fees, negotiating fee arrangements, and then working on any other discretionary projects assigned by the board and IFC. This slide does have some overlap with the previous slide, but really what this slide is getting at is the overall decision-making process for the investment strategy. So in the middle, you have the asset allocation study. This is again the annual analysis that decides what the policy targets are going to be to each asset class. And then further down the line is where we get into the individual manager selection, as well as the structure considerations for each asset class. But off to the left, and it's labeled here as spending policy study. And really these are the constraints, the investment objectives that really serve to inform the asset allocation study itself. So these are things like the statutory requirements, the spending policy that is really the objective of the various funds. So this really feeds into how we lay out the asset allocation study and what those allocations really end up being. Here we have a look at the relationship that we've had with the State Treasurer's Office. We've been working with the STO since 1997. On the left side of the page, you can see, where that kind of started, and on the right side of the page, we go all the way out to 2023 and where we currently stand. So you can see that back in 2000, total portfolio value was about $4 billion. The amount of investments in equity was just under 10%. The portfolio was almost entirely fixed income and cash. So you can see the 74% allocation to fixed income. And then over on the right side of the page, you can see the allocation as of March 31st. So you can see just how far we've come. Total risk assets, back in 2000 was entirely in public US equity at 9.6%. And today that stands at around 50%. And that's made up of US equity, international equity, private credit, real estate, hedge funds. So really a diversified mix that's really gotten the allocation to a higher expected return, higher diversification, a lot more similar allocation to the other US sovereign wealth funds. And then the top half of the page, you can see just a timeline of the implementation of all these enhancements. So we kind of lay out when each asset class was added, as well as other things that have fed into the investment strategy. So changes in the statutory constraints, in 2006, you can see was when the strategy reached the goal of 50% in total equities. And then in 2017, that cap was raised to 70%. And then in 2021, most recently, that 70% cap was lifted. And instead a reference portfolio that Patrick discussed earlier was put in place, comparing, rather than having a 70% cap on risk assets, it's really looking at a risk profile, a 70-30 mix of stocks and bonds as the benchmark portfolio. And then most recently, increases to private assets, private equity, infrastructure, private credit was added in 2021. And then most recently in 2023, we've had further streamlining of the investment policy, increasing the private assets allocation, and consolidating the income funds with the total return funds. And then just building off of that, kind of some current upcoming initiatives, as well as ongoing initiatives. Currently what we're working on is really getting that transition plan for the newly approved long-term targets. And this involves really a pacing analysis of those increases to private equity and private credit, primarily for the increased private equity allocations for the income funds that are going from 0 to 15%. That Patrick talked about earlier, that is going to take 5 to 70 years to roll out. And then a review of the reserve funds, which Patrick also mentioned that we'll be looking at reviewing that asset allocation at next year's asset allocation meetings. And then ongoing initiatives, continued performance monitoring through our customized reporting, both monthly and quarterly, ongoing investment manager monitoring and due diligence, spending policy analysis for the permanent funds, as well as the sovereign wealth fund peer analysis. This is a peer analysis that we put together annually in the fall of each year that looks at the current allocation and performance of US-based sovereign wealth funds that we've been putting together for 3 or 4 years now. And with that, I'll take a pause there. Happy to take any questions. Otherwise, I'm going to pass it off to Janelle to talk about some of the other teams at RBK.
Committee, any questions? Continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Just to wrap things up, we also wanted to highlight just the depth of resources that are available to you and the Treasurer's Office and all of the different constituents that we work with in this relationship. So we have a listing here of a wide variety of resources. Some of them that Jake hadn't highlighted before include the Sovereign Wealth Fund Research Group. So here we're leveraging our experience with other sovereign wealth funds around the US and providing some best practices and ideas going forward in that space for you. So really here, again, we just wanted to reiterate that not only is our approach to investment consulting really a team effort, but we also take that through the entire firm, and we're able to leverage all of these teams and different resources across the firm to really provide best-in-class consulting advice for you. The other slides I won't get into in too much detail, but they're just kind of outline the specifics of some of those higher level teams. But again, happy to take any questions or comments at this time.
Committee, any questions? Looks like there's none.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Hicks.
Yeah, and I know this might be a question for the Treasurer's Office, but given all those different divisions you have with RVK, how many of those do we utilize through the Treasurer's Office? Do we use that whole fleet? I'm just looking at like defined benefit plan solution would be something WRS would probably be interested in. And within that whole fleet of programs that they offer, which services do we utilize?
Yeah, so on this list here, so things that directly touch you all would be the capital markets team. We have the insights group, which is kind of our thought leadership practice. Investment manager research is probably one of the most frequent touch points, as that relates to investment managers across all different asset classes. We also have the investment operations solutions group, headed by Jonathan Kowalik, and so that really functions for any type of operational functions within the Treasurer's Office. So thinking about your custodian relationship with JP Morgan there, and then the Sovereign Wealth Fund Research Group as well. I would highlight.
Thank
you. Carry on. Do you have more to present, or is?
No, I think that concludes our prepared remarks for now.
Okay, thank you very much. Treasurer's Office wants to weigh in, I see. Introduce yourself.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Caleb Simpson. As the treasurer announced earlier, Deputy CIO. Just really wanted to reiterate, really not only the fact that RVK represents what we consider to be best in class as far as institutional investment consultants. Furthermore, just the wealth of knowledge and the repository of knowledge that they have. Quite frankly, I'll use the most recent transition from the former treasurer to the current treasurer, and just being able to bring the new administration up to speed, given our lead consultant has been our lead consultant for the past 20 years. He's really seen this plan grow from an all bond portfolio to the current construction that we see today, and has all of that minutia, all of that detail, all of that past policy thought and construction, and not only why we did it, but some of the constraints and lessons learned along the way that, quite frankly, no one else would have. So it's just been a joy and a pleasure, and very, very it's been a very constructive and positive working relationship. And I also will say that at the same time, Mr. Keevan, as well as the rest of the team, are very transparent, very open, and very honest, and willing to contest any thoughts or ideas that we may have that they may not agree with as being either a best practice or willing to offer up differing opinions. They're definitively not a rubber stamp.
Caleb, where are the touch points as far as who they interact with? They're related to your office. They have some relationship to IFC, SLIB. Can you just describe how they operate within your system?
Absolutely, Mr. Chairman, and the committee. So RVK acts as both the consultant to the Treasurer's Office as well as a separate consultant to the State Loan and Investment Board. In addition, the touch points, Every time we have an IFC meeting, they have a representative present to speak to performance, to speak to investment manager recommendations, to speak to structural changes. So they're touching really all three layers of the organization. On a day-to-day basis, from top to bottom, we may be reaching out, point in case, within the last few days with their performance analytics team, right, to discuss improvements in performance processing. So my colleague Cheryl O'Connell has reached out in the last week to their performance team. Mr. Dare there, we reach out on occasion anytime there's a question regarding manager transition. Of course, Mr. Keevan is our main touch point. Anytime we have either a thought or we want to bring our best ideas with regards to manager research, he's really the focal point that will then direct the attention internally and get us the resources we need.
Thank you. Any questions?
Mr.
from
Chairman, because we've had
Senator
a
Hicks?
long relationship, Deputy CIO, with RVK, and I don't know how long they work for SLIB and how long they work for the Treasurer's Office, and that contractual relationship's been, but that's not really the question I'm trying to get at. So, because we've had a long-term relationship with them, and the IFC is a relatively new manifestation of an entity that we've set up, I think it was 2017, it really didn't become functional until probably 2018, 19. Have we seen an increase in the utilizations of RVK services as we've built out the IFC, or has it retained relatively steady across this horizon? And the reason I ask that, and I think you've already touched on it, is it's again, it's nice to have another independent analysis and stuff, but are we getting duplicates of services between RVK and the IFC? Or is it more synergistic that they build better decision-making within our investment strategy? So how long are we increasing the utilization of RVK as associated with the increase and the build out of the IFC, I guess is the question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator Hicks. Absolutely, I would characterize it as being a synergistic relationship, and there not being much overlap between both bodies. Point in case, when it comes to manager research and manager relationships, oftentimes we'll use both RVK as well as the IFC as pools of knowledge and pools of thought, and they both come from a different perspective, with RVK offering up their lineup of what they view as best-in-class institutional managers. And oftentimes there's overlap, but sometimes just given the wide universe and the private market relationships and the deep knowledge that the IFC has, they either may know these firms and have a different perspective or working relationship, or may know other firms, in which case they can bring those forth to us as staff, and we can work with RVK to conduct our diligence process.
Follow up? Anybody else? Committee?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
That conclude your remarks? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Anyone else want to speak to this topic? Public testimony? Okay, we'll close this one out and move on to our next topic, which is inflation proofings of the state permanent fund. And that will be a presentation by our LSO staff. Welcome. Introduce yourself.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and committee. I'm Polly Scott. I'm with LSO Budget Fiscal Division. And pleasure to be here with you today. I think you all have these long handouts that I'm going to be talking about. Can you hear me okay? Okay. And they're also online as item 501 and 502. So this was a request by Chairman Obermuller, who can jump in here if he wants to explain the origin of his request, but he was looking at the statute that sets out the spending policies, and that's 94719. And it also has the priorities in order of importance for the spending policies. And the second priority is protection of the corpus of the permanent funds against inflation. And he brought forward a while ago that he would like to see a specific example of that. And this work that you're looking at really started with Chairman Obermueller and my colleague from Budget Fiscal, Dean Tempty. And I have since joined the work. So what you have in front of you, starting with the Permanent Wyoming Mineral Trust Fund, or the PWMTF, is a history of the development of the fund according to the deposits that go into it. And this information is all taken from the state treasurer's annual reports. And it's laid out in an accounting style. Starting in column B, we have the cost basis of the fund, and we started in 2001. I should mention this fund, started much earlier than 2001, but we started in 2001. And Chairman Obermueller really gave the directives about, when we needed to make decisions about the specifics of this analysis. So he laid out, start in 2001, and in column B, that's labeled B at the top, we start out with the cost basis of the fund at the beginning of fiscal year 2001. We also commonly call that the corpus. The second column, C, is the constitutionally required severance tax deposit for that year. And then columns D through G are additional deposits that occurred that year for different reasons. And then in column H, those additional deposits are summed up. And in column I, that's the end of the fiscal year cost basis. It's just the sum of that. And then that is pulled to 2002, column B, for the beginning of the year cost basis. And that's how that works. And we just pulled all this information from State Treasurer's annual reports and laid that out. You can see in column H at the end of these 22 years, the total additional deposits there were $2.559 billion. Then moving on to columns I and J, this is really just a comparison of the ending year cost basis, which includes all those deposits, and the market value of the fund. And K shows you the investment gain or loss for that year. At the bottom of column K, you can see that the investment gain is $903 million. And when we add together that $903 million at the bottom of column K with the $2.559 billion at the bottom of column H, we have the number at the bottom of column L, which is $3.462 billion. Then moving on into columns M and N of this table, we are creating an estimate of what the value of inflation would be for our fund during this time frame. And Chairman Obermueller just made the decision, use the consumer price index for urban areas for the fiscal years July to July. So in column M, you have the rate of inflation according to CPI-U for that period. And then in column N, we are simply multiplying the rate times the beginning year cost basis. And then we're also putting inflation on earlier years' inflation to create a compounding. And so when you come down to the bottom and you have the sum of column N, it's $3.249 billion. And so the comparison that's being developed here is between the number at the bottom of column L and the number at the bottom of column N. And the value of the additional deposits plus the investment gain exceeds the estimated value of the inflation on this fund according to the specifics of this analysis by $213.7 million. And that is what the request was, just to draw out a specific example of comparing inflation over this period to the additional deposits and investment gain.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Committee, any questions at this point on this sheet? A lot to
Mr. Chairman.
absorb. Senator Hicks.
So when I look at this, and I think because a lot of these are what I would call voluntary distributions back to the corpus that we've made. So if you go to column, just so I'm understanding this right. So if we go to column E, it's direct appropriations, and even the statutory 1%, because we've diverted that statutory 1% on a number of times, and that's why you don't see it. And then some of these other direct appropriations. So when I look at the component of actually inflation proof, and that's a permanent infusion of money or revenues, not the one-time scenarios. And so if we take those one-time scenarios out, have we actually inflation proof this, or are we just making additional contributions to the corpus that mask the impact of inflation? My analysis would be, I don't know that these numbers are correct because of these one-time distributions or deposits to the corpus versus true, in my opinion, true inflation proofing of this thing should have an automatic index that it just does it. There's AKA the constitutional 1%, and then the compounding of that. I hate to say we're inflation proofing an account when it's all contingent upon one-time distributions or the largesse of the legislature deciding to add additional money to the corpus. Would I be wrong in that assessment, Mr. Chairman?
Yes. Yes. No, I'm just kidding. I think we'll hold off on the answer to that and have you move to your next analysis of this same fund based on the other way of looking at it, based on the constitutional aspect of this.
Okay.
And then we'll, that's another perspective on your question. Okay?
Okay,
on
so
the
if
back.
everyone would turn this over to the next page. So after Chairman Obermueller asked his first question, he followed up with a second question, wanting to know a comparison of inflation with the fund. If the corpus or the cost basis only included constitutionally required deposits and did not include the additional deposits that were in those columns D through G on the other side. So we worked on developing this here, and so we start out, again, column B, we start out with the beginning year cost basis. We start in 2001. So again, up until 2001, there's all deposits here. But starting in 2001, we're only adding in the constitutionally required deposits and not those additional deposits. Then what we do, and you can see what those deposits are in column C. Then in column D, we're creating a modified, what I'm calling a modified cost basis, because we're modifying the cost basis we saw on the other page, which is the traditional cost basis, which has all deposits. And we're creating a modified cost basis plus the prior inflation. And so in column E, I'm taking the amount in column D and taking it times the CPIU. And then it takes a year to get started because we needed a starting point. And then what we do in 2002 is we're adding the prior year's constitutional deposits, the modified cost basis, plus the estimate of CPIU inflation for the year, and we pull that down to the next year. We do that every year, and we're creating a compounding effect of the inflation like we did on the other side. We go and do that every year. And on this chart, we went forward into an estimate of 2023. So 2023 is an estimated number. But when you go all the way through this, and the note at the bottom of the chart actually has the the comparison kind of written out. But when you go all the way through this, the result that you get is what you might expect, is that you're outpacing inflation by even more, because you're not inflation protecting those additional deposits on this side of the paper. So you're actually, in this example, taking out those additional deposits and going forward into the first portion of 2023, you're outpacing inflation by $1,858 million, or 1.858 billion. So beating inflation, and this, with this specific analysis, much more than on the other side over these 22 years. And again, with all the specifics that were determined for this scenario.
Polly, could you just, before we talk about the implications of this and the kind of the theories underlying it, could you just go through the other sheet that involves a common school
Yes.
fund? And just,
Yes.
it's a similar scenario that'll look familiar, but let's just get through that part of it and then we can have our discussion on it.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, happy to do that. So moving on, we've done the same thing for the Common School Permanent Land Fund, or the CSPLF. And I can jump to the bottom now, unless anybody wants me to walk through every column. But in this case, with the Common School Fund, we get to the place where we are comparing at the bottom of column M, the value of our additional deposits plus our investment gains at 1.390 billion, to the estimate of inflation at the bottom of column O, which is 1.578 billion. And so we're a little short on this over these 22 years by 187.5 million scenario. And I should point out that we didn't go forward on 2023 here, and we know we have those discretionary deposits that were legislated of the $367 million. Those are not on here at all, because this does not have 2023 in it, and those deposits have not happened. Okay, so this one gets a little, has a little bit of a different outcome, where over these 22 years with this analysis, the inflation is higher than the additional deposits and the investment growth by 187.5 million. And then when we flip to the other side, if you'd like to continue, and do the modified cost basis, where we're only looking at the constitutionally required deposits, not the additional deposits, the outcome flips, as you might expect, because we're not calculating the inflation on all of those additional deposits, just the constitutional deposits. And so when you get all the way to the bottom, and we do go forward estimating into 2023, and we're comparing to the market value of the fund, which has everything in it. The comparison is between the 4.72 billion of the fund market value and the 4.227 billion of the modified cost basis plus inflation. And so we are outpacing inflation by 492 million with this modified cost basis example in the specifics of this analysis, this time frame using CPIU, et cetera.
Okay.
Anything else, Mr. Chairman?
So that completes your portion of the, why don't you stand by, so
Okay.
any questions from the committee. Committee, I'm going to share some observations about this that I've derived from this analysis. One is that you need to establish an inflation, or you need to establish a baseline to measure the effect of inflation. In other words, when this analysis on the backside, these are all based on the constitutional requirements, the amounts that were put in, the 1.5 contribution to this. So when we look at it from a purely constitutional standpoint, we're way ahead of the game, and to treat inflation fairly, you do need a baseline, what you're going to include and what you're not going to include. Because if you you have a big year and you dump $500 million in there, does that automatically generate an obligation on the legislature to inflation-proof that piece of it? I'm not answering that question, I'm just raising that question. So in that respect, it seems to me that inflation is one of these things that needs to be monitored by a committee like this, not subject necessarily to an automatic appropriation saying, we're going to put the 1% in here as an inflation hedge, when the analysis says we're already there, we don't need to automatically do this. It becomes a process of a more dynamic process for JAC in analyzing where we are with these dollars and if we need to move dollars and if it makes sense to do that. One additional observation that I want to note about this is when we talk about intergenerational, the intergenerational piece here, I think sometimes the idea of intergenerational and inflation sort of get mixed together, and I think they're a little bit different concepts. The intergenerational piece, I believe, should be measured by the allocation of severance dollars going in. That's where we share those dollars, is the dollars coming in. And then once they're in, now we're dealing with the inflation piece and whether we're staying up or not staying up with this. So it's sort of that dynamic split between how we look at intergenerational and how we look at inflation. Committee, I'll open it up. Does anybody have any comments about this work? It's at this point, I consider it totally educational. It's not deriving anything relative to this. It's just trying to understand this topic and how we deal with the subject of intergenerational and inflation adjustments, just for your continued thought about how we deal with this in the future. So any comments here?
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Hicks.
It just strikes me that if we'd have taken this analysis back to the 1980s and stuff, when we were dealing with a number of years of runaway inflation, that things would have looked a lot different. And it may be the future that we're looking at now. And I do think it's a responsibility of this committee when we start to look at this. And, you look at 2021, 5.37, 8.52, CPI came in at 4.1 or something yesterday. I think it would be good at some point in time that this committee make a recommendation back to the legislature when you have these rampant inflation years, that it's taken into the consideration in the budgeting process. In other words, when we have inflation that's outpacing our mineral revenues, which is probably the future as we look out, plus we get into some giant rare earth deposits or stuff. But as our mineral resources continue to decline, which is a severance tax component, and we run into high inflationary environments, we very well could see this start to not be inflation proof. And I think from a monitoring standpoint, it would probably be something that we would want to look at statutorily. At least the Capital Finance Committee is chartered with this responsibility to at least make a recommendation that we're at the point where inflation outpaced the 1%. And we're not inflation proofing, and we should do that probably on an annual or at least a biennial budget. Look at those. And for no other reason as make an informational as circumstances change to the legislature. Just be a recommendation to say, look, this year, the account wasn't inflation proof because of low mineral prices and runaway inflation, and maybe at that point in time, we start making better financial decisions moving forward. But just a thought.
In another corollary to that idea that's worth thinking about as we move forward is that division of responsibility of the Treasurer's Office and the legislature as it relates to inflation proofing. If you think about the way the Treasurer's Office is moving toward a values-based investing, I think a logical conclusion would be that inflation adjustments should be built into that model. I think if you gave a if you gave your money to an investment manager and said, I want to take our 5% spending policy, what can you do with the rest? The manager would, assuming that 5% has a reasonable relation to income, then you're saying to the manager, I'm going to hand you my $9 billion. Whose responsibility is it to inflation-proof this going forward? And I think the managers would weigh in and say, we'll inflation-proof it plus. I think that's how they would view something like that. So there is some kind of division of responsibility here to throw into the mix and think about as we move forward on this. Anyone else with two on the board? Who is up? I don't see. Oh, their little hands on the corner. I didn't see who was first, so Chairman Harshman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate your analysis. I just, kind of a question, maybe a statement, but I just, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but just a little history on this, and I think your analysis starting around the turn of the century is correct, just because I think a couple things happened then. I think, first of all, we went into the spending policy, the Harvard Yale trust model. I think Speaker Tempest was key in that. We established the Cap Fin Committee, and then we started investing in equities. Because all through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, if I recall, I mean, there was no equity investment. The constitutional requirement is we spent every bit of it, and then there was no Cap Fin Committee. And so I think, this moving to this Harvard Yale Trust, late 90s, early 2000, has been huge. And I think, boy, what we're doing is really incredible. And so I just applaud all those folks before us who got this started. I think, all the work that's been done over the last couple of decades. And I think if we would have started in this same model back in the 70s in the beginning, good Lord, I mean, it would be really astounding. But thankfully, we started where we did. And that's where we went from 2 to 4 and 4 to 8. We're going to continue to grow this thing. So appreciate the analysis and the history on this. And again, I think we just keep on rocking and stay the course. So I think we're doing a great job. So appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I guess I would look for this as kind of been your presentation to help us better understand our efforts, or have we addressed inflation and generational issues. And so I want to make sure that I'm understanding this correctly and would appreciate that. But it appears, going back to Senator Hicks' point, that we should have some trigger to, if we see large inflation numbers, that we address that if need be. But I think what Polly's research has done here has shown us that, for all intents and purposes, the constitutional required funding into the permanent mineral trust fund has satisfied the impacts of inflation. And we've seen that when we have taken additional efforts to add additional money to grow it faster, that even through those efforts, we've added enough extra in to address inflation. But we have at our hands the ability. We have this statutory 1%, which we have put in, and then in other times we haven't used it. But that seems to me to be the plan B, that if inflation is rearing its ugly head, that then we make the recommendation back that this is a year that we need to make sure that we put the 1% statutory in place so that we can guard against inflation. So it appears to me that we kind of have some of those safeguards already in place. So am I seeing it wrong? And if not, would you correct me?
I agree with that analysis. I think, you know, the Appropriations Committee has to be sitting in a dynamic position to move money where it's most needed at the time, and I think that 1% money is one of those things where you look at the current situation. Every legislature has to do that, and this is part of that analysis. Anyone else want to comment on this?
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Hicks.
I wish we were jumping right to tomorrow's discussion on our statutory trust. Because this is going to be a very important discussion that will lead into tomorrow, because we don't have permanent increases or diversions or funding sources into those statutory trusts. And so this discussion of inflation proofing some of those statutory trusts will be important tomorrow, because we're losing to inflation every year because they have a fixed amount in the corpus and they have no provision with any income coming into those corpuses. So remember this discussion that we had today, because it's going to be very pertinent for the discussion tomorrow when we look at these statutory trusts that have no permanent fund of revenue coming into the corpus. So just as a FYI, Mr. Chairman.
All right, anybody with any last comments about this topic? Thank you very much. You did a wonderful job on this analysis. Appreciate it very much. We have another item to cover here. Where are we? I guess I should say any public comment on the topic that we just concluded. Mr. Treasurer.
Real quick, I think Senator Hicks was absolutely spot on when he said that we've got all these different contributions in there, and that's the only thing that actually has kept our head above water. There is one statutory trust that has a modest provision. That's the infrastructure it's one for the Transportation Authority. And essentially, you can only spend 90% of the income and 10% remains in the trust. So that's a modest one there in that statutory one. I think what you really have to look at is when you put the money in there, if you're going to make something more permanent, that you do it in times when you don't have inflation. And so the trigger would be a low inflation, because with high inflation now, boy, you're really hitting it on both ends. You're not getting as much income, and your services you don't have the revenue to pay for it. So if you look at some kind of automatic trigger, one of the triggers should be in areas of low inflation, that you figure out a way to actually double up the tips or something like that, or put more in there when you can't afford it, because you can't afford it in a day like today, because the only reason we're here is because we got lucky on the energy front again. But if you're not going to get that type of luck, then, those are the things you look at. And then when you do the tour this afternoon, I've got a whiteboard on the generational fund, and that's something that's truly an intergenerational mechanism that's built, primarily in this area of inflation, and primarily to dump some money back in and increase it well above the rate of inflation. So.
A follow-up?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, thank you for that, Treasurer Meyer, because that is one potential alternative that we'll be able to explore tomorrow as we discuss some of these statutory trusts, is looking at diverting part of the earnings back into the corpus to inflation-proof it. But most of them, we don't do that on. And so there is one example out there, and it will be something I think this committee is going to have to look at and analyze if that's an alternative that we want to look at for some of these statutory trusts. So thank you.
I have a question for you, Mr. Treasurer, before you leave. It goes back to my earlier question about the division of labor here. In theory, over time, shouldn't growth equities account for inflation?
Yeah, it should, depending on, how fast you pull it out, because you are going to have your ups and downs. And in the down things, your reserve funds are going to, I think, mitigate the ups and downs. So with the new structure that we have, I think that's going to be more conducive to addressing inflation as far as growth. But you're going to have, basically unrealized capital gains that will, continue to move forward in the construct of it's not the corpus per se, but in the construct of the total market fund value.
Right. So the idea of inflation is a pretty dynamic analysis between how stocks are moving, and I mean, it shouldn't just be a direct trigger, should it? We have inflation, the legislature needs to dump a bunch of money in. I mean, it's not quite as simple as that. There's also the dynamic of how the fund is growing also, right?
Yeah, I guess it's more affordable when inflation is low, is the only point I was making. And when inflation is high, you've got all the services you have to provide, and they're costing you more, and you have actually less real dollars pouring out of the investment stream.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Anyone else want to weigh in on this before we move on? Next up, we've got the State Auditor's Office. Welcome. Introduce yourselves to the public. I think we know who you are, but all our thousands of listeners out there need to know who you are too.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. My name is Christy Racinas, and I have the pleasure of serving as your state auditor. With me, I have Edie Troutwine. She's the deputy auditor, and I have Erin Benskin. She's in charge, she's one of our managers. She's in charge of the accounting division, and the accounting division produces the annual comprehensive report. So, Mr. Chairman, the entire Annual Comprehensive Financial Report, or ACFR, I believe has been provided to you electronically. I'm assuming you've all read it from beginning to end.
All 256 pages. Thank you very much.
Perfect. So we actually also have provided 3 paper handouts, and so I'm going to maybe have you not worry about the electronic document right now. And you should have this really fun, fabulous pictograph that Edie put together, and I'm going to start with that. So we're here to talk about the ACFR right before lunch, so that's exciting. We are always really pleased when we are asked about this, because this is something our office puts a lot of time and effort into, and it frankly, it often doesn't, receive a lot of attention. So first off, what is the ACFR? Essentially, it is the financial statements for the state of Wyoming. So most of you have probably had experience with a balance sheet and income statement for a business. Essentially, that's what the ACFR is for the state, put very simply, balance sheet and income statement. It reflects the state's financial status at a point in time, and then also financial results or inflows and outflows over the year leading up to that point in time. So for most businesses, that date is December 31st, but for most governments, including the state of Wyoming, that date is June 30th. So that's always when our ACFR, that's the point of measurement. So I'm going to go over to this chart and talk a little bit about how the ACFR comes to be. So we, the State Auditor's Office, we're third down in the box. We are responsible for actually preparing this report. And when I say this report, I do mean the entire 250 pages that you were given. However, in order to do that, we have to gather substantial information from all state agencies, actually, over the course of months and months. That pretty much goes on the entire year. We also have to obtain information from entities called component units. That's an accounting term. These component units actually have separate financial statements, and they're separately audited. But at the end of the day, they're considered an integral part of the entirety of the state, and so they're added into our ACFR. So the big ones are going to be YDOT, the University of Wyoming, the Business Council, the lottery, things like that. And that determination of what makes a component unit is driven by accounting standards. There's specific, questions and analyses that go into that. So we come together, like I said, gather up all this information and produce that document. Then moving up the chart, we are required to have external auditors come in and audit that report. So essentially, they're taking the whole document and delving in and making sure everything is okay and accurate and put together accurately. Now, I really want to stress, this is not a minor endeavor for the external auditors. They spend months on site, thousands of hours, different levels of partner review. We have, 5 or 6 folks usually on site for several months, just doing nothing but delving into all these numbers, interacting with our staff, the treasurer's office, all the state agencies for additional questions.
Are they already on board for this next audit?
Mr. Chairman, we are just entering the ACFR season. They show up on site generally. They're already working on the ACFR September? Yeah, usually September they're here. They're here physically present in the building. And they've actually, just as an aside, they have been using the media room in the basement in your off season, and that has been very appreciated by both them and us. Okay, so the whole goal of that endeavor is for the external auditors to opine that everything we said is materially correct. What does materially correct mean? They're not checking it to the penny. If we're $100 off or $1,000 off, they don't care. They're saying, okay, a user of these financial statements is going to be able to read them and understand both the financial position and operations of the state of Wyoming. Now, one other note, the primary focus of this audit is not fraud detection. If they come across fraud, of course they would report it, and some of their procedures certainly check for fraud, but I just want to make a note that that's not their primary purpose. Their primary purpose, again, is to say, yep, these are materially accurate. So at the very top of the chart, you'll see the Department of Audit. Now, they are the agency that actually puts out the RFP for the audit contract. They select the external auditor, and they actually hold that contract. So my office is responsible for putting together that document, doing the work. So it wouldn't be appropriate for us to then get to select who we want to audit it. So that's why there's that division right there. So I'm going to switch gears for just a minute and talk about a different sort of audit that the state of Wyoming receives. Any entity, public or private, that receives over $750,000 in federal funds is required by federal law to have what's called a compliance audit. We use the term compliance audit. It also is sometimes called a single audit or an A133 audit. That's the section of law it comes from, I believe. So just so you know, those terms are interchangeable. That audit also has to be done by an external CPA firm, and the primary goal of that audit is to check whether or not we're in compliance with federal requirements for federal grants. So big picture, the feds are saying, if we give you enough money, we want you to have we're requiring you to pay for a special audit to make sure you spent our funds correctly. So of course, since the state receives way over that amount of money, we also have that compliance report, which I believe has been provided to you electronically as well. That compliance audit also documents and analyzes internal controls and lists findings regarding both federal funds and the preparation of the ACFR. Just as a note, our current, and I believe I used an acronym without saying such. Our current auditors are McGee, Hearn, Pice. That's a large firm out of here in Cheyenne. They do both our ACFR audit and they also do our compliance audit as well. So over on the left-hand side of our chart, there's a box with a couple things that I'll hit very quickly. Both the ACFR and the single audit are historical. And I just make that note. These are extremely important documents. It's really, of course we think they're important, but it's important to note that in terms of looking forward, they're not the most useful tool necessarily. So the most recent ACFR that we have is from June 30th, 2022. An ACFR usually isn't done until about 6 months after the year end. So just know whenever you are looking at an ACFR, it's, I don't want to say old or useless by any means, but it is historical information. It's not necessarily looking forward or guaranteeing future results. The ACFR date is, we are required to have that done by the end of December. The compliance audit actually has to be done the end of March. So those reports are separate and dated differently. And skipping down a few things. One other note, governmental accounting is very, very different than regular GAAP accounting. We do have to follow GAAP, but we also have to follow GASB. That's the Government Accounting Standards Board. They put out numerous pronouncements that we are required to follow. And some of those pronouncements cause an immense amount of work because essentially they say, you have to do things this way. So thus the 250 pages, right? All of that is driven by pronouncements and standards that we have to follow. Okay, so moving on quickly to the 2 pages I have pulled out of the ACFR and printed for you. The first one that I'll direct you to first is the statement of net position. It's going to be your tall portrait-oriented one. Now, and I'll say again, we've pulled out these 2 documents from that, but these do not stand on their own. I'll reiterate that.
The statement of net position for the public, that's basically a balance sheet, right?
Yep.
Yeah, okay.
Mr. Chairman, exactly, yes. This for a government, you term it differently, but essentially this is everything we have, everything we owe, and the difference. One other note before we go over these. I know that you as legislators, and frankly our office as well, especially those of you that have been on JAC, you tend to think of things in terms of agencies. You know our state and our expenditures by agency. The ACFR and the pronouncements we have to follow, they don't care about agencies. So you won't find any, line that specifically relates to Department of Audit or Department of Health. That's not the way this is put together. So some of the familiar things that I'm used to looking for, and you may be used to looking for, it's not laid out in the same way. Okay, so I'm going to go real quickly over these. We're happy to attempt to answer questions on the fly, but please understand that if you have a specific question about a specific number, or tell me the 48 things that make up this line item, I'm probably going to have to phone a friend and provide information after for you. So on this statement of net position, the top section is your assets. That's clearly labeled. Below that, you have your liabilities. And the difference, to put it in layman's terms, is the net worth of the state of Wyoming. The columns from left to right, you will see governmental activities and business type activities. The difference between those, government type activities are things that we all know we do as a government. We don't operate them like a business. And Department of Corrections is a great example. We well, I don't want to say we provide incarceration as a service, but I guess that's accurate. We do that without expecting to make money on it or be compensated for that. So that's going to be something that goes in your governmental activities. Business type activities are going to be things, the biggest ones are workers' comp and the unemployment fund. We do operate those more like a business in the real world. You know, we charge for a service and we pay out expenses related to those charges. So that's the difference there. And then the far right column, you'll see the component unit term again. So that is the sum total of all of the component units added up. So you'll note very quickly that cash and investments make up about 87% of our assets. So rough numbers, about 29 billion of 33 billion in assets is cash and investments. So that's why we have to work so closely, and we are in lockstep with the Treasurer's Office throughout the preparation of this audit. So they are our main partners in this endeavor. Even though we're responsible for the final product, we have to rely on them for a huge amount of the information to put this report together. And then down at the very bottom, where it says net position, you can see the numbers essentially, like I said, the net worth for the state of Wyoming. It's around 22 billion if you don't include the component units. And then that is divvied up into different categories, essentially based on how expendable or not it is. You know, and you'll see those terms: restricted, you know, non-spendable corpus, that's obviously the PMTF and other things. So, and again, I said I'd go real quickly, but we're happy to answer questions offline or when I'm done. Moving on to the statement of activities. So this is your landscape.
Just one statement about your balance sheet. I think, you know, it should be pointed out that this is a beautiful balance sheet. That's probably the envy of the world, and the prior legislatures have been a big part. Many of the people that still serve have been a tremendous part of building out a balance sheet that is probably unmatched anywhere. So just a point.
Mr. Chairman, I would agree.
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Hicks.
just real quick, when we get down to the net positions, all of those I understand right up until it says recreation resources. So what is that? I don't know what that is.
Chairman, off the cuff, I would wonder if like the Wildlife Natural Resource Trust Fund would be included in there, but that's something we would have to probably pull exactly to see what numbers go into there.
Those numbers would closely match up with the Wildlife Natural Resource Trust.
They would?
Yep.
You said, yeah, Mr. Chairman, that would be my guess, but we'll double check that and shoot you an email.
Anyone else? Okay, carry on.
Okay. The statement of activities. Now, this in private business land, this would be your income statement. Of course, we wouldn't call it that for a government because hopefully we're not, you know, going about this to make income. Now, a warning, and we've had multiple conversations with the good chairman about this. I'm a CPA and I have a really hard time wrapping my arms around this document, these numbers and what it's trying to tell you. So the format is driven by GAAP and GASB. We don't have a lot of flexibility in how we put this together. So I don't want to, I'm certainly not insulting anybody's intelligence, but if you're looking at this saying, what the heck is this? I don't understand this. Please know you're not alone.
Hey, I said that when I first looked at it, so.
I said that this morning. No, I'm kidding.
I appreciate you coming in to explain it to us. If you would go through it, you know, in terms of the layout, just tell us what's here.
Yep, Mr.
Thank you.
Chairman, I will
Chairman?
attempt.
Senator Hicks.
I have great pause for this upcoming presentation. If you don't understand it and the auditor is a little concerned, what chance do I possibly have in grasping what is about to be presented?
Senator Hicks, I said I didn't understand it when I first looked at it. That has changed.
Okay.
I think everybody will have the capability on this panel to understand it once it's laid out.
Okay. So, Mr. Chairman, on the, I'm going to call this the top left quadrant, the very left-hand column with numbers is your expenses. And then the 3 columns after that talk about revenue that we receive in against those expenses. So these are programmatic expenses and revenues. And what I mean when I say programmatic is it relates to a certain program. And you'll see different categories on the left, again, broken out into our general governmental activities and then our business type activities. And I'll use a relatively simple example. If you go to business type activities and look at the workers' compensation insurance line, you can see we had about 246 million in expenses, and we had 203 million in charges for service for that. And then for workers' comp, the next 2 columns are blank because we didn't receive any operating grants or capital grants to that program. So that's how that part of the statement works. Then if you move to the top right quadrant, all that does is subtract your expenses from your revenues and essentially gives you and again, I'm being a little loose with terminology here, your profit or loss on that program, knowing profit is not what we're going for. And you'll see that most of these things programmatically do not pay for themselves completely.
Just interject here on the program revenues. That includes the charges for services are what Wyoming citizens and businesses pay in. Is that would be true?
Mr. Chairman, that's correct, but I don't know that it would be exclusively Wyoming businesses. It would be any.
Right, anybody doing business in Wyoming.
Yes.
That's a
Yes.
better way of saying it. The next column, operating grants, that's federal money?
Mr.
that's a
Chairman, by and
federal-
large, that's going to be a majority federal money.
So there's 2.5 billion of federal money for that year.
Mr. Chairman, give or take, that's going to be accurate.
And then the other one, the other column is grants and capital grants contributions, that also federal money?
Mr. Chairman, we only have one number in that. I would think so. Do you?
There's 2.
Sure, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, that is primarily the federal grant money that was received by the Department of Health for the the construction of the Veteran Skilled Nursing Home.
Okay, and the one down below in component units, you got the Wyoming Department of Transportation, 18 million there. That,
Oh, yes, Mr. Chairman. So that would be YDOT. And so the difference between those 2 columns, capital, that's going to be for capital construction. So where we've received federal money for CapCon versus where we've received federal money to just operate, like for Medicaid.
So you have the program revenues, that's charges for services, federal money. So the losses that are thrown off don't take into account state money that's put into these programs. We make up the difference with state money for all these lost positions theoretically, correct?
Mr. Chairman, yes, and that sort of leads into my next comment. The bottom half of the sheet is general revenues. And again, very briefly, this is what, these are revenues that we can add back against everything else so that we can apply to any of those things above. And mostly those, as you know, they're going to be taxes, FMRs and investment income. Those are the big chunks down there that we also get to use. They're very much revenues, but they're not related to one specific program.
Right, that's what we do, is allocate the money in the budget.
And Mr. Chairman, one last note before I take any more questions. Down at the bottom, at the very bottom line, third over, you see a number 22.251 billion, and the number above that, that is our net position at the beginning of the year and net position at the end of the year. So the bottom line, if we're thinking about this as an income statement, the state of Wyoming reduced its net position by about $365 million. So not a big change in the terms of the 22 billion that is our net position.
So when that 251 is on the balance sheet, and you can trace it over to the other sheet we looked at on the second to the last column, that's where it ties out. And then the component unit number of 8.2 ties out to the balance sheet bottom number. So
Yes,
you can
Mr.
see how they, how they relate there. Committee, any questions about the income statement? Senator Hicks?
Mr. Chairman, I have lots of them, but I'm going to hold them for later, when somebody can actually explain some of this stuff to me.
Yeah, you mean as in a private
Yes.
meeting? Okay, thank you, Senator Hicks. Anyone else want to jump into this discussion? Really appreciate your presentation on that. You know, I want to let the committee know that this statement of activities is actually published on the state auditor's website as a separate and distinct statement. You know, it's a one pager. So instead of being intimidated by 200, and the public too, you know, that instead of being intimidated by a 250-page report, you can look at one of the most significant pieces as a one pager on their website, and it'll show up just like this. And you can start looking at it line by line. You know, that isn't our purpose today here to go through this, what was in general government and that kind of thing. No, that's not what I ask of the. So they have responded exactly like I wanted. In terms of the general layout and understanding it, are there any questions at this point from anyone on the committee? Okay. Do you have any further comments?
No, Mr. Chairman, we got off quite easy, I would say.
Well, you did your homework, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate you
We're
coming in.
happy to, if anyone ever wants to stop by our office or set up a meeting to ask
Yeah.
questions, we are thrilled.
Yeah, and I would concur with that because I have been in your office and I have asked about specific line items. So anyone's free to do that. I know your office would be happy to entertain anyone who has a question about a specific line item. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, committee.
Any public testimony related to this topic? Where are we on the schedule? Have we reached lunch?
Mr. Chairman, you've done an outstanding job. We're 30 minutes ahead of schedule.
Are we really? Wow, that's awesome. Yeah, well, thank you very much. All right, I think we've had a pretty productive morning. Can we move up our meet time this afternoon? No, we have the tour of the treasurer's office at 1:45, so.
You know, it's up to you and the treasurer's office if they're ready,
I don't
but
see them around.
yeah, you might want to let them know if they come over early that they're actually there.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So for now, I guess we're gonna break till 1:45 since there's.
Mr. Chairman, are we
yeah.
meeting here and then going over to the treasurer's office?
I think it'd be easier just to meet at the
LSO, what
treasurer's
should we do about this?
Mr. Chairman, it's up to you if you want to go over together. The treasurer's office is expecting you at 1:45, knocking on the door, so to speak. But it's up to you if you want to gather together here and go over together or make your way individually.
Okay, I think we'll just, everybody on their own schedule to show up, 1:45, treasurer's office. Everybody know where it is, or do we need some instruction from LSO?
Second or third floor on the east.
East wing, third right.
Okay.
If it's not raining when you go over there, use the elevator that is closest to the Capitol. If you use the one in the long corridor, you'll end up at their back door, not their front door.
Okay, why don't you give us the instruction on how to go through the corridor here in the Capitol and how to get there through?
If you go through the connector, you'll take the elevators that are on the east side, so on the house side, and you'll take that up to the 3rd floor, and that will you will arrive just outside their suite.
Right, everybody understand that? Any more questions? Okay. All right, that sounds good. Right. The 315 will be back here.
And
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, the treasurer's office has said that they can accommodate the committee earlier if they choose to.
Awesome, awesome.
If you'll just
What time?
let us know when to give them the go-ahead.
1 o'clock. We got an hour and 15 minutes right now for lunch. That's probably plenty. Let's see if we can get in at 1.
Mr. Chairman, I did email
Oh.
the Wyoming Retirement System representatives who are on the agenda for 3:15 and let them know that the committee may be running early, and they said they could be early if you would like.
Great. Let's see, so hour and a half, 2:30. Can they be here at 2:30 then?
I will check with them right now. I'm thinking that would work.
Okay. That sounds very good. Get out of here a little early today, perhaps.
Mr.
It's always
Chairman?
nice. Senator Hicks.
I just have a question before we break for our colleagues online, and Representative Harshman, are those bars behind you?
They are shadows of
You know,
bars in front of it.
There's no art in anything. It looks like bars. I'm just wondering, is there a reason you couldn't be here in person?
No, those are actually closets. Yeah.
All right, we are adjourned until 1 o'clock.
So, Mr. Chairman, we're meeting 1 o'clock, treasurer's office.
1 o'clock, the treasurer's office.
For our online folks, we join us 2:30. We here for the final retirement.
Correct. Thank you, Representative, for, following up on that. Appreciate it. Yeah, thank you very much.